everyone. As written by my colleague, the webinar is being recorded for everyone's information and for further reference later. I would like to start by saying that this webinar will be treating the topic of the introduction to the Accelerated Education Working Group's Monitoring and Evaluation Toolkit for AEPs. And before we go into the main topic, we'll go over the housekeeping slide. Basically, most important points here are that the participant audio and video are disabled. You should all post questions using the Q&A function at any time. The session, as mentioned, is being recorded. We have closed captioning available in English, and the recording and presentations will be shared on the INEE website and also via email to all participants. And now I have the pleasure to turn it over to our presenter, Kayla Bover from the Accelerated Education Working Group. Kayla, feel free to start. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Natalie. And thanks to everybody at INEE for hosting this webinar. Thanks to my colleague, Kat Cooper, who's also here from the Accelerated Education Working Group, who did quite a lot of work on the Monitoring and Evaluation Toolkit as well. And just, you know, and also to her colleagues in Save the Children as well, who the background to a ton of this work is derived from all of the hard work that they've been doing, along with the other colleagues in the Accelerated Education Working Group. As Natalie said, my name is Kayla Bover. I'm a consultant to the Accelerated Education Working Group, and I was involved in the development of the Monitoring and Evaluation Toolkit. I'm really excited to be able to share it with you today and to just sort of answer any questions you might have. This is really the start for us of a lot of efforts to disseminate the toolkit, which was somewhat delayed due to the COVID-19 pandemic. So, you know, we had to shift some of our activities over the last year. And so we're really looking forward to putting this toolkit out there, supporting its use by organizations and partners working in accelerated education globally. I know it's a tool that has been in quite some demand. So today in the webinar, I'm going to tell you just briefly a little bit about the background of the Accelerated Education Working Group, some of the tools and guidance that we've produced over the years that that you might find to be useful. And then we're going to really take a deep dive into the M&E toolkit for AEPs. And so today the focus is really on the deep dive. It's not a panel presentation today, but more of the deep dive into the toolkit. So to provide a little background on the AEWG, so the Accelerated Education Working Group is a working group made up of partners working in accelerated education globally. It is currently led by UNHCR with representation from 10 other organizations, including UNICEF, Plan International, IRC, Save the Children, ECHO, War Child, USAID, UNESCO, EDC, and NRC. The AEWG was formed in 2019, and that was in response to the proliferation of accelerated education programs at the global level, which differed really greatly between countries and even within countries. And the lack of a shared definition at the time about what accelerated education is, as well as the lack of orientation, standards, and indicators for effective provision of AEP, really posed challenges to the quality, measurement, and institutionalization within policy and humanitarian frameworks of accelerated education. So the primary aim of the AEWG has been to support this harmonization, standardization, and also contextualization of accelerated education programs in order to improve quality education programming with the end result of improving outcomes for out-of-school children and youth. So a key task for the AEWG in its first 2 years was to develop and agree upon a common understanding of what accelerated education is. And this was achieved in the AEWG's shared definition of AEPs, as well as definitions for other programs related to and often conflated with accelerated education. And those include catch-up programs, remedial programs, and bridging programs. And especially now, during the time of COVID-19, these definitions are becoming more and more relevant as we really see the uptake of various flexible education approaches to meet the needs of out-of-school children and youth. And so, as we present this, while we are focusing on accelerated education, in the monitoring and evaluation toolkit, we just want to recognize that there are a wide range of approaches that are being rolled out and scaled up at this point that are similar to accelerated education, particularly catch-up programs and remedial programs. And so, happy to have a conversation and the discussion about some of the similarities and differences, and also how these tools might be useful in these other types of programs as well. So then the second major step that the AEWG took was to explore and define who the learners are that accelerated education programs should target. And so we decided to develop a decision tree, which is intended to support funders, implementers, and other stakeholders to decide where AEPs are an appropriate response and where they're not. So where other programs might be more appropriate than AEPs. Next, we looked at the elements and the key dimensions of quality accelerated education provision. And this involved the development of 10 principles for effective practice, as well as an accompanying guidance document. And these 10 principles make up the foundation of all of our tools and guidance, and they aim to clarify the major components of an accelerated education program. And then finally, we looked at how AEPs might be measured in terms of their effectiveness and outcomes, developing a shared learning agenda for accelerated education, and the monitoring and evaluation toolkit, which I'm going to talk a little bit about today, was developed with the intent to provide technically sound guidance for how to conduct monitoring and evaluation for both learning and accountability purposes, particularly in an accelerated education program. And so altogether, these tools and guidance make up a conceptual framework for accelerated education. And this conceptual framework really aims to support the harmonization of accelerated education programs globally, ultimately leading to improvements in quality and better outcomes for children and youth. In 2021, the AEWG has had 5 areas of focus or broad objectives. The first 4 are really continuing from previous work, and then we added in a focus on COVID-19 as we saw there to be a need. So that first area of focus is really focusing on the objective that AEPs are included by more governments in national education plans and policies. So the AEWG works with and supports ministries of education to explore needs and potential solutions to meet the needs of overage out-of-school children and youth, particularly in their contexts. Second, the AEWG is focusing on strengthening the evidence base, which I'll talk about in just a bit. And then third, we're really focusing on seeing the quality of accelerated education programs improve, and that's really going back to the definitions, the decision tree, the guidance, and the principles, but then all of the various tools and guidance that have been developed over the years are really for the purpose of improving and supporting the improvement of quality provision of accelerated education. And particularly in 2021, we're focusing a lot more on disseminating and supporting the uptake and use of the tools and guidance in order to really reach a wider scale and reach greater uptake of the tools and guidance. So that's our focus around improving quality this year. And then lastly, the AEPs are better resourced by all key stakeholders for scale and quality is our fourth area of focus. And that's really working with donors and other organizations to consider when AEPs are an appropriate education response, often working in or focusing on donors working in conflict and crisis affected contexts. And then in addition to these 4 sort of core objective areas or outcome areas, we are also responding to the COVID-19 pandemic, and we have developed several technical notes to support ministries of education and other key stakeholders to deploy flexible education options, such as catch-up programs and AEPs, as an effective response to meet the needs of learners who have missed out on education due to COVID-19 and who might not be able to return to education after schools start to reopen. And part of this has been updating our decision tree with a greater focus on the specific context of COVID-19 and when learners might need particularly a catch-up program versus an AEP or other sort of remedial support within, for example, the context of a formal or non-formal education program or school. It also then led us to develop a set of 10 principles for catch-up programs as well. So we do want to recognize the difference between catch-up programs and accelerated education programs, although we do recognize that there's a lot of similarity. And so also I'd like to ask Kat if you can post into the chat the link to the AEWG site or page on the INE website, because all of these tools and guidance that I've mentioned are all available on the INE site. So you can go and check us out there. You can also reach out and get in contact with us through there. All right, so turning a bit more to this priority area of evidence strengthening. So several areas are being carried out under this second objective area in 2021. The first activity includes disseminating this M&E toolkit that we're going to dive into just in a moment. But we'll also be exploring a couple of other areas as well. So first, we're going to be updating and expanding our accelerated education mapping, which helps us to have a global picture of where accelerated education programs are implemented, by whom and for whom. Data for this initiative was collected back in 2019, and so we'll be further disseminating those findings, as well as beginning to update and expand that research as well to capture more information on AEPs globally. We'll also continue to support and nurture existing and new research partnerships. And one of those is our ongoing research project, which is called Accelerating Children's and Youth's Education Through Systems Strengthening, or ACCESS. And that is a 44-month research partnership with the University of Auckland and funded by Dubai Cares. And the ACCESS Research Project critically assesses current opportunities for and approaches towards integrating and sustaining non-formal education programming, and particularly AEPs to meet the needs of out-of-school children in Colombia, Nigeria, Pakistan, Uganda, and Jordan. And that research seeks to understand who needs to be involved, when and why in the process of integrating AEPs and other non-formal education programs. And it aligns with the AEWG's efforts to build alliances and advocate for policy change in countries where there's a critical need and an opportunity for accelerated education to meet the needs of out-of-school and overage learners. And then finally, we'll be continuing to collate evidence in line with our learning agenda, share and present at key conferences, webinars, meetings, and other events throughout the year. So now let's take a look into the monitoring and evaluation toolkit. And I just want to remind everybody, so we do have a question and answer box. We have a chat box. I'd be really curious to hear from you all both in the Q&A or in the chat. If you do have experience with any of the concepts that I'm talking about in relation to AEP, or if you've used the M&E toolkit from the AEWG, really curious to hear about your experiences with that. Any reflections that you have on any of that, that'll be really great in the chat. And then any questions or questions that you want to hold for the discussion at the end, please do drop those into the question and answer box, and we'll have plenty of time for discussion at the end. Great. And Kat just dropped the link into the chat box for the M&E toolkit, so hopefully you're able to access that at your leisure. All right, so first of all, I just wanted to explain a little bit about why we felt it was important to have an M&E toolkit for AEPs. And I wanted to illustrate this with a bit of a puzzle or a riddle. A little bit of background. So donors and implementers, evaluators and researchers and others over the years have taken up the AEWG tools and guidance for the effective implementation of AEPs quite eagerly. And it has had a lot of reach over the years, which has been really exciting. But a lot of folks have been asking for support around monitoring and evaluation for a long time as well. And we also observed that other monitoring and evaluation guidance was not available for accelerated education programs specifically. And there were a number of reasons why we thought it was important to provide guidance tailored specifically for AEPs. So let us look at this example. This is completely fictitious, completely made up, but I think it really highlights something that's very important, at least to me, in understanding some of the ins and outs of the M&E Toolkit and what we tried to do. So first, imagine that there's an accelerated education program called Excel. And in the catchment area of Excel, there are 2,000 children who were identified in the needs assessment to be overage and out of school. And after working with the community, the local formal school, and the Ministry of Education to design and start up the Excel program, the program then enrolled 1,500 out-of-school children. And 3 years after the start of the program, or one full AEP cycle later, 1,300 of those children completed the final level of AEP. And then after completing the program and taking the primary leaving exam, about 1,200 of those completers transitioned into the local formal schools. So I would like to ask you, do you think that's a success? And to do that, I want to do a little bit of monitoring and evaluation. So if the Excel program has an indicator and a target that 75% of out-of-school children complete the AEP and transition into secondary school, what do you think is the transition rate? And do you think they achieve their target? So I'm going to pause here and do a little bit of math. What do you think is the transition rate here based on the figures that we have above? And do you think that the Excel program achieved their target? And you can type your answers into the chat box. So I'll just give just a minute here. I'm really curious on how you guys all calculate it. Okay, we've got one response so far. Okay, 2 responses, interesting. Great. Interesting. Okay, 60%, less than 75. Does anybody think it's not 60%? Interesting. 65%, okay. Does anybody find that there are 80% transitioning or even higher than that? All right. Well, it seems like we've got consensus that the answer is no, they haven't achieved their target, which is actually really interesting to me that there is a bit of consensus, although there's quite a few more people here that haven't yet responded. So if people disagree, I'm super interested in hearing why you disagree. But the way that I had calculated it, my answer actually was it depends. So awesome. Very cool. All right, Paul, thanks. 92% of children who do complete the AEP then transition to secondary school. Very cool, Paul. The program was able to capture 75% of the out-of-school children. It was not a success based on the set target. Great, Cosmos, thank you. Perfect. So yeah, I guess my answer to this was that it really depends. And it depends on how we calculate it, really. And to me, it's not particularly clear based on the question that I asked, which was sort of the intent. It was a little bit of a trick question, but a lot of you answered this, thinking about it in this first way. So if we calculate the indicator based on the total number of out-of-school children in the catchment area who we're trying to reach, we see that we only helped 60% be able to complete AEP and transition into secondary school. However, if we calculate the indicator based on the number of learners who were enrolled in the program, we see that 80% actually completed and transitioned. So if we calculate it that way, we might actually say, look, we met our transition rate. So how are we defining out of school children? Are we talking about everybody in the catchment area, or are we talking about those that we enroll in the AEP? And then lastly, if we consider this, and this is less common, I think, if we calculate it based on those who were eligible to transition, as in they had reached the last level and they had passed the primary leaving exam, then actually we think, wow, we were really successful. We reached 92%. So this actually highlighted a few of the reasons for me why I felt like we needed a little bit more explanation around how to do monitoring and evaluation in accelerated education programs, because it's a bit different from non-formal education more broadly, as well as from formal education. So due to the lack of guidance on measurement in AEPs, stakeholders, sort of as I just gave an example of, we noticed that folks were conducting monitoring and evaluation very, very differently in accelerated education. And so understanding the effectiveness and the impact of AEPs was particularly challenging because there was no agreed upon indicators or ways of calculating them. And that second part, the ways of calculating them, is just so important. Back in about, I think it was 2019, 2020, the AEWG updated an evidence review, a systematic evidence review on accelerated education programs from a previous review that was done in 2015. And while the AEWG found that accelerated education programs were increasing access, and to an extent they were able to say that AEPs were increasing learning outcomes, there was quite a lot of limitations just because of the lack of standardization and guidance in measurement in AEPs. We also noticed that AEPs are often faced with selecting from an indicator menu that are often required by funders and other organizations that might not be particularly well suited to the unique needs of accelerated education programs, and that many programs actually only reported on outputs, like the number of accelerated education centers established or the number of teachers trained. When AEPs were reporting on outcomes, a lot of times they were just sort of the basics, the enrollment completion rates, but they might only be with, for example, with numbers rather than percentages. So they were also limited in sort of describing the larger picture of the reach and the effectiveness of AEPs. And then beyond that, the calculations and the reporting on these outcomes were often done in very different ways. So again, all of that makes it really difficult to understand the effectiveness and the impact of AEPs. But we know that AEPs share some common goals and objectives, and these align well with the AEWG's 10 principles. And so there's really a need to be able to define and provide guidance for how to measure those goals. And these goals really can be categorized under 3, maybe 4 specific areas. And the first area is around equitable access to and completion of basic education. Second, around more learners obtaining certification in primary or basic education. And third, improved learning outcomes, especially in literacy, numeracy, and life skills. And then in some cases, AEPs also focus on transition back into the formal schools, although others sort of see that as a limitation and beyond the scope of what they're able to measure. So we felt as the AEWG that if we could provide tools and guidance to better help donors, organizations, and evaluators to capture and document the outcomes of AEPs, we could better support them to contribute to the evidence base on what works for whom, in what contexts, and why. And then finally, there were a couple of concepts that we really wanted to highlight that we feel are important for monitoring and evaluation in accelerated education programs. And those are that, first of all, AEPs often operate in complex contexts that are frequently affected by crisis and conflict. And so we need ways of capturing data and being able to learn and adapt programming. And so for this reason, we wanted the M&E Toolkit to be able to provide tools and guidance for AEP that help programs to identify the most useful data that they can capture, and to be able to set up a systematic system for being able to do so in a clear and useful way that enables that learning and adaptation. And then second, we really wanted to highlight the fact that AEPs are focused on providing equitable access to education for all children, particularly focusing on those that are marginalized by conflict, crisis, poverty, and forms of discrimination. So the toolkit has a strong focus on supporting programs to monitor equity. So now a little bit about what is in the toolkit. So the toolkit is a set of tools in corresponding guidance. It's designed for funders, designers of programs, implementers, and evaluators who are responsible at the development and implementation stage, as well as those who are planning for and later evaluating AEPs. It aligns with the learning agenda of the AEWG, which has two broad objectives. First, to assess the efficacy of AE programming using the principles in terms of the outcome areas that I had listed. And second, to evaluate the contribution and cost effectiveness of AEPs to national and global provision of equitable access to quality basic education. So the M&E Toolkit can really be used at the start of the program to provide inspiration for your own M&E framework, or as a whole package, which can be adapted to suit your program. And it can also be used as a basis for reflection and refining your existing framework. And while the toolkit is designed with the assumption that users have a basic level of familiarity of monitoring and evaluation, it is also very helpful in that it provides guidance and advice to users to improve technical knowledge around monitoring and evaluation, especially in relation to AEPs. So the main takeaway really is that the toolkit is, it's kind of like your toolbox. If you go to the hardware store, you need to, build yourself something new, or you need to fix something old. You find that toolbox that's going to help you be able to do that. This M&E Toolkit is supposed to help you be able to do that. It's supposed to help you be able to build your own M&E framework, or be able to reflect on and improve your existing framework for monitoring and evaluation. The toolkit was developed through an extensive and iterative process of consultation with M&E specialists, local and international NGOs, and bilateral and multilateral agencies. It was first drafted in late 2018 to the beginning of 2019, and then was followed by a really thorough review of existing indicators. That was based on a very thorough review of existing indicators required by donors and policymakers, as well as theories of change and monitoring and evaluation plans of AEWG member organizations. And that initial development was then followed by a really thorough internal review by the AEWG, as well as remote consultations with organizations in 12 countries, plus field testing with a consortium of 8 partners in Uganda. So a lot of heavy feedback and consultation before the finalization, which occurred in early 2020. Great. So diving into the toolkit, Kat already dropped the link into it, but in order to access it, again, you can find it in English, Spanish, French, and Arabic on the INEE Accelerated Education page. You can download it as a zip folder, and the entire toolkit really is downloaded in an Excel document and there's an Excel document, a PowerPoint, and a Word document, all of which are editable and adaptable. And you'll find when you download it that the toolkit first consists of a user manual pictured here, and then it has five tools in a single editable Excel document, all of which are adaptable to meet your needs. And those include a theory of change, an objectives and indicator menu, a sample log frame, a sample indicator monitoring table, and a sample M&E plan. It also comes with 4 annexes, which really help you to build out your M&E framework. And the first is an adaptable PowerPoint of that theory of change, so you can really change it to meet your needs, suggested specifications for several recommended indicators, and a template for a monitoring and evaluation narrative, framework narrative, if that's required, for example, by the funder of your program. So when you download the zip folder, the first thing you should really access is the user manual. And this is sort of your instruction manual for how to use that toolkit or that toolbox. And it walks you through the 5 main steps that we've identified and specified for developing an AEP's entire M&E framework. And each of the steps corresponds to one of the 5 tools. And each of the steps described in the manual includes several parts, including key definitions and explanations of the major concepts and how and when you would use them. It also includes an explanation of the process for using them and specifically for developing that core part of the M&E framework. It provides an explanation of who should be involved in each of these steps. And it provides tips for effectively using the tool and for developing that part of the M&E framework. The first step then is to develop a theory of change in collaboration, or at least in consultation, with key stakeholders, and those might include local and national government, local communities, local formal schools, and other partner organizations. And so as you'll see it pictured here, and this is an entirely, again, an entirely adaptable theory of change that you can use parts of, and you can leave parts out of it. You can use it as inspiration really to develop your own theory of change. But this theory of change, as you'll see, it's a visual representation of the if-then relationships between a program's inputs and activities, as well as the intended outcomes and overarching goals. And it helps you to think about what will happen when you implement your program and how and why that happens. And really, a theory of change is very truly the foundation of your monitoring and evaluation framework, and of course, the program design. And so this step really should not be skipped. A theory of change should really be considered the starting point of your design and of your M&E plan. And it should be continuously revisited and revised throughout the lifetime of the program as you learn more about the context and what is working and why, so that it's a tool to be able to support both your data collection, your analysis, your reflection, and then also ultimately adaptation of programming if you need to go that route. This generic AEP theory of change includes three main long-term outcome areas. And again, those are the equitable access and completion, certification, and learning outcomes areas that I mentioned previously. And those are shown across the top here in orange. And some programs also might choose to have a focus on transition into secondary school as a high-level goal. Then the short-term outcomes align with the Accelerated Education Working Group's 10 principles. They're shown in green. Obviously, there's not one green box for each principle, but some of them are merged, some of them are broken apart. But in large part, this is where we see alignment with the 10 principles. And these are related to learner attendance, inclusivity and safety in the learning environment, provision of high quality instruction, community accountability, management, and alignment with policy. And so the idea being, if you achieve these, they're more, they're short term is a relative term, but if you achieve these outcomes, the idea is that you'll be able to increase equitable access and completion, increase certification, and increase learning outcomes. And then finally, in brown and blue, we see several different, ideas of what program outputs and activities might be, respectively. And again, all of these components are adaptable in theory of change PowerPoint. And so you can use them to sort of generate ideas, or if you take the PowerPoint and you want to just sort of manipulate it for your own program, you can do that as well. So the second step in the process, which is based on then specifically on the theory of change, is to identify the objectives and corresponding indicators to measure progress against those objectives. And to support this process, we've provided an objectives and indicators menu. As you'll actually notice here, this screenshot is from the Excel document. So you'll see that there are the 5 tabs, which with each of the 5 tools. So the first tab was with the theory of change. Now we're on to that second tab, the objectives and indicators menu. And we really wanted to have this all in one place in a single Excel document so that folks have everything that they need in a single place. They don't have to bounce between different documents, different databases, et cetera. So we hope that that's useful for you, but obviously you can break it all apart as needed. Take what you want, leave what you don't. So then you'll see here the objectives, which are in about the third column right there. Those are where we list the intended outcomes or the outputs of the program, depending on the level in the theory of change. And those are, again, directly connected back to the colored boxes in the theory of change. And so you'll see, as an example here, in the objectives column, increase equitable access to and completion of basic education is our objective listed from the theory of change. And then along with each objective, we provide 2 to 3 indicators that are more traditional indicators, such as percentage of overage out-of-school children and youth in the catchment area who enroll in AEP, and percentage of AE learners who complete the last level of AEP. And one thing just to point out, thinking back to that sort of riddle or example that I provided, you'll notice that these 2 indicators are more specified, more specific than the example that I gave around out-of-school children and youth transitioning. And so we really wanted to make sure that both in the indicator, we used precise language about exactly what we're measuring so that there's a lot more clarity around, what it is that the indicator and that the target and then the subsequent percentage is actually representing. For each of the indicators, or for each of the objectives, again, we have some indicators that people can choose some and they can leave others. So it's a menu to choose from, but it's not that you have to use every single one of them. And so we wanted to make sure that we provided enough indicators that programs feel they have something that's relevant for them to use. And then also really important in the white boxes to the right, we also define the indicator and provide a suggested calculation for that indicator. And again, this is really homing in on exactly what is it that the indicator is trying to measure. So one thing that's particularly challenging is a lot of times when doing the evidence review, the Accelerated Education Working Group and the group of consultants found out that there was a lack of clarity on how data was calculated from where it was drawn. And so it was really difficult to make conclusions about the effectiveness and the impact of accelerated education programs. So we really wanted to provide a lot of clarity around what the indicator means and how you can calculate it. And that's also really helpful, not only for the M&E specialist who's doing the calculations and want to remember how they did it, last quarter, and then also for clarity in reporting. But if there's a turnover in staff or somebody else is working on it, in the next year, the next quarter, it's really important to specify exactly how you're calculating that figure. In line with our aim of ensuring equity in accelerated education programs, we also included several equity indicators, and those are a type of indicator that go beyond simply disaggregating data by gender, displacement status, disability status, or any other disaggregation type, but actually it creates an indicator to measure equity specifically to be able to track it over time. So instead of just having the same indicator as listed above, so the percentage of overage out-of-school children and youth in the catchment area who enroll in the AEP and then disaggregating by girls and boys, the equity indicator actually asks you to subtract and find the difference between girls and boys. And the idea is that over time, what might be a larger difference at first, 10%, 15% might reduce over time. And so it helps you to be able to, and then you might even see a flip, for example, if it goes into the negative, oh, look at that, we really heavily focused on girls. Now boys are, having a harder time enrolling, something like that. So it gives you a more concrete way to track progress and challenges in equitable access and equity within all aspects of the AEP, really. And then finally, we provide approximately 10 recommended indicators, which are denoted here with an asterisk, which we really encourage all AEPs to collect data against these outcomes. They're some of the most basic figures for measuring progress in AEPs. They're not going to surprise you what they are. They're around enrollment, completion, transition, certification, learning outcomes. And so, the idea is that we really wanted to sort of home in on the most important data to collect so that as we're building the evidence base as a community of EIE practitioners, we're able to, have sort of similar language, similar facts and figures to be able to make more assertions about the effectiveness and impact of accelerated education. And then for those specified indicators, we provide further clarification on how to define, calculate, and disaggregate them in a separate annex. So then the next three tools, the final three tools, are all samples of key components of a completed monitoring and evaluation framework. And a bit differently from the theory of change and the objectives and indicators menu, these are more of an example that you might draw from for your own ideas, or you might use them as a template and adapt them. So they're a little bit different, this type of tool. But the first one of those is the logical framework, or LogFrame. And the purpose of this is really to bring together your objectives, your indicators, and particularly your assumptions around achieving those objectives. So this LogFrame is a table that organizes the theory of change in a much more matrix-like way. It helps you to articulate and think about the assumptions about the different components of the theory of change. Those might be assumptions about what needs to be in place in order for that objective to come true. It might also consider other contextual factors that might prove barriers. And it might also, help you to think about how the different objectives are connected, or how the different, how sort of lower level objectives need to actually occur in order for your higher level objectives to come true. You can use the LogFrame. It's frequently used as a facilitation tool for dialogue between implementers, partners, education officials, funders, and others. And so it can really help folks to kind of visualize it in a much more table format with a lot more information than the theory of change can provide. And so over here on the right, we do have some examples of assumptions, but again, the idea is not that these are prescriptive. In fact, they might not be accurate in your context. So we've filled this out more as an example rather than, to say what must be in place or what the assumptions are for your particular program. And so rather we provide guidance in the user manual for you to think about some key questions around determining your assumptions, such as what must be true for this objective to be achieved, what must be in place, what is out of our control, what are the risks, structural factors, and human factors that affect our program. The fourth tool and step in the M&E Toolkit is the M&E plan. And an M&E plan is really where you document and provide guidance on how to collect, analyze, and report on the data based on the LogFrame. So it brings together some of the main ideas of the whole monitoring and evaluation framework and synthesizes it into a single toolkit that kind of just lays it all out there for you. These are our objectives. These are the indicators. And this is exactly how, when, and who is going to collect this data and analyze it and use it. So again, the sample M&E plan in the toolkit shows you what it might look like. There's a lot of blanks in here because really it requires you to think about and use this tool to think about what is the best way for you to collect this data? Where can you get this data? Who's going to be responsible from your organization? How are you going to analyze it? When are you going to report on it? But a couple of key features of the M&E plan, usually it lists first the indicator and potentially a baseline figure if that's applicable, although for some of the indicators that's not always applicable. And it will provide a target. It also specifies in the plan how you're going to disaggregate data, where you're going to get that data from, and when. And just an important note that in accelerated education programs, we really feel it's important to disaggregate data at a bare minimum by location, gender, AE level, and displacement status. But there are other sort of identities or characteristics that folks might choose to disaggregate on, such as ability or disability status or ethnicity. And you might also choose to go beyond disaggregation to use equity indicators. And then finally, it might include in the plan a specification around who is responsible for carrying out each part of data collection, and then analysis and reporting as well. And then just another note that we do provide an annex for a full monitoring and evaluation plan narrative. This is often not required by, by funders or by organizations, but in the case that it is, we provide a narrative template that you can use to help think about how you can write out this full plan, this full document or database into a narrative form if you need to. And then lastly, the final step and tool is the indicator monitoring table. And this provides an example of what an indicator, what the table might look like. And really it's a matrix which brings together all of the data from your monitoring efforts into one place and helps to compile data against your objectives, stores it, and provides you a place for where you're able to conduct the analysis from, where you're storing the data which you're going to conduct the analysis from. It lists all of your indicators and your disaggregates along with your target. And then the columns break down things like the location, the AE level, and then, potentially the time points, baseline, midline, and end line. So really it's that go-to place for all of your data from monitoring your accelerated education program. So wrapping up again, we are really looking forward to disseminating this toolkit widely. We encourage you to use it, give us feedback on it, share it with your partners. We'd love to hear from you about how you're using it. And yeah, thank you very much for the attention and look forward to any questions that you might have.
Great. Thank you so much, Kayla, for your presentation on the M&E Toolkit. Very informative. Now, to move really quick Q&A session to address a few received during the webinar. The first question for Kayla is only for one AEP cycle. The M&E Toolkit Impact Indicator is about measuring transition to formal education after completing AEP, which won't be possible. How should we measure impact?
Great, thank you for that question. That's a really interesting question. And I think one of the things that I just want to highlight is that is often true. Sometimes funding cycles are really only for one full AEP cycle, or sometimes even for less. And that does provide a lot of challenges to measuring effectiveness and impact. But I think one thing that could be useful for the M&E Toolkit is that there are a lot of different types of indicators that you could measure. So, a lot of AEPs do stop short of measuring transition for a variety of reasons, not least of which is what you're describing is that, the duration of the program is short and it sometimes is very, very difficult to do a tracer study to measure transition into the formal schools and beyond that. So that's not out of the usual. The M&E Toolkit does have quite a few indicators which can help you to think about effectiveness, less on the impact side, I understand, but still are very, very important. So some of the indicators around completion of the AEP, progress through the AEP is a helpful indicator. And another one that's really important is certification. So you might be able to measure if your AEP cycle is to complete the 6 years of primary, for example, you might be able to track how many learners are able to obtain the certification in primary school, for example. And then another one too that I really want to stress is the indicators around learning outcomes. So we have several learning outcome indicators around particularly literacy, numeracy, and life skills. And we offer a couple of different ways to actually measure them. So some of them might be focused on, reaching a certain sort of proficiency level, for example, reaching grade 2 proficiency by the end of level 1 of the AEP, whereas another form of indicator might actually be looking at an increase in how to describe this, an increase in skills compared to like achieving sort of like a ceiling or some sort of target. So there are a couple of different ways to look at learning outcomes that we look at as well. And so I'd encourage you to check out those as well, because it's not, you are not alone in having this challenge of being able to measure transition. I hope that one day we will be able to see a situation where funding, particularly in crisis and conflict affected contexts, is more amenable to conducting tracer studies and better measuring impact. But that said, you are not alone in not being able to do that right now. Thanks.
Thank you, Kayla. No, that's really helpful. Thanks. And now moving to the second question again for you, Kayla. Is the AEWG planning to develop monitoring and evaluation tools that we can use to measure the indicators?
That is a really good question. So to be determined, I guess, is the answer there, or it has been thoroughly considered. One of the things that we've thought about doing is compiling and vetting various monitoring and evaluation tools of organizations. However, we did decide against, at this point, developing the tools to be used because they are quite specific to the program and exactly how you all decide to monitor it. However, there also are several different tools available, especially for learning outcomes and stuff like that, to be able to use UEZO, EGRA, EGMA, those kind of tools. ACER, a lot of programs use ACER. And so we also didn't want to reinvent the wheel. So at this point, we don't have plans for developing specific tools for use. And we have considered potentially creating sort of a resource library, but we're not there yet. So really great feedback. Would be interested to hear in the chat sort of what folks think might be a useful useful additional support on that. Please do let us know in the chat, what might be helpful.
Thank you, Kayla. We have another question that just came in, and the question is, what advice does the AEWG have about doing a baseline assessment first for literacy and numeracy and then doing endline? So I think the question is about whether the learning outcome assessments can be used for an AEP evaluation.
Interesting question. And again, really interested to hear in the chat from others their experience with this. And Kat, also, since you are so involved in the development of the toolkit, please do type in the chat if you have any reflections on this. So first of all, I don't think that we as an AEWG are taking a particular stand on exactly the best way to measure learning outcomes. What we wanted to do was really to provide some options. We do, and I personally do, think that it's very important to be able to measure literacy and numeracy. It's one of the primary goals of accelerated education programs, is to help learners not only achieve certification in primary or basic education, but also to improve literacy and numeracy outcomes, as well as life skills. And I think it's very important to assess literacy and numeracy, especially. And I think that there are a lot of tools for, again, using, for conducting baseline, midline, and endline assessment of learning outcomes. So a lot of folks use the ACER, UEZO, EGRA, EGMA, but particularly ACER to really sort of see progress over time in learning outcomes. So thank you for that.
Thanks, Kayla. And our final question from the audience is, what is the difference between a basic literacy program and an AEP?
That's a really great question. I'm actually even going to build off of that question and ask what is the difference between those and catch-up as well, if I may do so. So the difference, there's quite a large difference between basic literacy programs and accelerated education programs. But the main difference can really be boiled down to two things. The first thing is equivalency. So in basic literacy programs or functional literacy programs, a lot of times the objective is to help learners get, as it says, the basics, or what they need in, to be able to live in their day-to-day lives, or the work that they need to do. Functional literacy programs might be around, what it is that they need to succeed in their workplace or in their home or in their community. But an accelerated education program is a true alternative education program. It's alternative to the formal schools in the sense that it provides equivalent skills and knowledge to the formal schools in a condensed time frame. And so in terms of literacy and also in numeracy, accelerated education programs should be providing the education that learners need to be able to sit and pass the primary school exam or whatever is the equivalent exam of the level that they're finishing in. So quite a large difference there. And the other main difference is that accelerated education programs should be working towards or leading towards certification for learners and then return back to the formal schools. And so it's quite a bit different from basic literacy and numeracy in terms of the equivalency and the certification and transition. And also just sort of a quick touch upon catch-up programs, because that's something that's very relevant right now for COVID-19. We do see difference between catch-up programs and accelerated education programs as well. And catch-up programs are just much more short-term. And so while they're focused on equivalency to the formal schools like the accelerated education programs, they're more of a stopgap measure for an education disruption that's about a year or less and helps learners to kind of catch up, get back on track to where they would have been. So it's not a full certification program. AEP is like, if you think of, its own sort of standalone program in or outside of the formal schools that, is a full intense program and leads to certification. Thanks.
Thanks, Kayla. Actually, we just got 3 more questions from the audience. Let's see how far we get. I'll just read the next one we got, which is from Noemi Gerber. She's saying, great that the toolkit identifies key indicators that all AEPs should measure. It would be interesting to learn from these results at a global level. Does the AEWG have any plans to collect these results for global analysis?
That's a really great question, Noemi. Thanks for that. Again, Kat or even Noemi, please do weigh in on your thoughts on that. At this point, I'm not aware of that. And I guess I am kind of wondering to myself about if that would be possible, and if it would be possible to make sort of sweeping comparisons across very, very different contexts and across very, very different countries. And so to me, some questions that it raises are sort of, what would be the purpose and the use case for such comparisons and global analysis? On the one hand, I think it could be really, really interesting to be able to do some sort of collective global analysis to understand the reach of AEPs. I also think it would be particularly challenging to make claims around sort of the effectiveness of AEPs as sort of a broad concept or broad type of program, because they do vary still quite differently from context to context, and they should vary quite differently. So I don't know, Noemi. I think that's a really, really good question. Certainly something to think about. And please do let us know if you have any thoughts on that, or Kat as well.
Great, thank you, Kayla. Trying to do this quickly, let's see. From Darius, we have a question. And his question is, will there be development of tools for countries where transition to formal education settings is delayed or not possible, but AE is still very much needed?
That's a really good question. And I think that is true for a lot of countries and a lot of contexts where transition to formal is very difficult for many reasons. And even where it's not difficult for a reason specific to the education system or the context, it might be difficult because, the things that kept learners out of education previously might preclude them from being able to return. I still think that the tools that have been developed by the AEWG are very relevant, both the monitoring and evaluation tools and the tools and guidance. But they would need to be, potentially adapted to meet your needs. So for example, if transition is very difficult to the formal schools, potentially because of lack of linkage to the formal schools, one component your program might focus on might be, working with sort of link schools. So there's already that connection made. Another thing might be your AEP might work at the more policy and advocacy level to work with officials to explore challenges, for example, related to documentation and of refugees transitioning into the formal school or something like that. So really important question. I also do think that the tools can be helpful in that way, but as always, need to contextualize.
Thanks, Kayla. Moving to another question from Paul Frizzoli. Does the guidance in the toolkit include ways to measure the quality instruction? Does it also look at innovative teaching practices such as learner-centered pedagogies and learning through play?
That's a really great question, Paul. Thank you for that. I think my answer is probably, unfortunately, no. I think you've pointed out a really important gap at this point and something for consideration. So if I can think back to all of the indicators that we do have, I think we do have, we do have some output indicators around teacher training, around sort of instructional spaces, learning spaces. I'm struggling to recall any solid outcome indicators on pedagogy and on teacher practice. So definitely something to look into for future adaptations to the toolkit. Thank you for that. If you do have any good suggestions too, I'm always very open to hearing or to receiving any sort of references for recommendations you have for how to best measure that.
Great, thank you, Kayla. Actually, yeah, the last question we had was answered by Kayla. By Kayla, by Catherine. So I think we're good now. And
right.
Thanks again, Kayla, for this presentation. Really wonderful to have you here explaining this to us. I know we're already past the hour, so if that's okay with everyone, we'll be ending the webinar. Kayla, I don't know if you want to say any final words before we close.
Great. Yeah, no, thank you, Natalie. Thanks to INEE, and thanks for everybody for attending. And please do grab my email or the email of Martha Hewison, who's the chair of the AEWG, and be in touch with any further questions, comments, or stories of how you're using the toolkit. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kayla, and thank you to all of the participants as well in the webinar. Thanks, and we'll be in touch, and of course, sharing the recording and all the related presentations. Thank you. Have a good day.